The jar of butter shouldn't exist. It had been underwater for 11 days, sunk in a sealed cedar chamber below the spring beside a Florida homestead that every sensible settler had called a fool's purchase. June Reed pulled it up hand over hand, twisted the lid, and pressed one finger into something cool, firm, and sweet. She laughed until the cypress trees echoed. Spring came early to Willow Sink in 1888, which meant the flies came early too. Elias Reed stood on his porch in the gray April dawn, listening to the wetland wake, frogs, birds, the soft push of water through reeds, and felt the particular pride of a man who had bought land nobody else wanted. He did not yet know what that land would give them. He only knew he was going to stay. The homestead sat on 40 acres of Florida flatwood and marsh, purchased for nearly nothing from a county clerk who had smirked when Elias signed the papers. The soil nearest the cabin was dark and damp, threaded with roots, alive with insects, and perfumed with the green and living smell of standing water. A spring-fed basin the size of a generous pond lay 50 yards from the front steps, its water so clear and blue-green that on bright mornings it looked like a piece of sky had fallen and taken up permanent residence among the cypress knees. Elias had built the cabin himself the previous autumn. Heart pine planks, a tin roof, a stone chimney that drew tolerably well when the wind cooperated. It was a 2-room house with a sleeping loft, a covered porch that ran the full width of the front, and a vegetable patch out back that June had planted with the optimism of someone who had not yet experienced a Florida summer. June Reed was 27 years old, brown-haired, steady-handed, and possessed of a practical intelligence that expressed itself in small, exact ways. The way she organized the pantry shelf, the way she solved problems with whatever was close at hand, the way she looked at a difficulty with her head slightly tilted, as though listening for the answer rather than waiting to think of one. She had come from Georgia with Elias 2 years prior, and she had never once asked to go back, though there were weeks when the heat was a physical weight and the insects were a living curtain. Their son Toby was 6, gap-toothed, and fascinated by water in the way that certain children are fascinated by one thing so completely that it colors their entire understanding of the world. He could spend an hour at the edge of the spring watching minnows change direction. He knew where the big soft-shell turtle rested in the afternoon. He had named 3 of the cypress trees. The trouble that spring was the same trouble every spring, only worse. The food would not keep. It was a Monday when June opened the meat box and found what was inside had turned. She said nothing dramatic. She simply carried it out, buried it, and came back inside and stood at the table with her hands pressed flat on the wood. 3 pounds of salt pork. Gone. "Third time in a month," she said. Elias sat down across from her. The cabin was already warm at 7 in the morning, and the humidity pressed in through the window screens like a second presence. On the shelf behind June, a small crock of butter had separated overnight, the yellow fat gone greasy and thin. Toby, sitting in the doorway with his feet hanging off the edge of the porch, watched a dragonfly hover over the spring and said, without turning around, "The water's cold, Mama." Neither of them slept well that night. Elias lay on his back in the thick darkness of the sleeping loft, listening to the frogs outside, and turned the problem over the way he turned difficult pieces of lumber, looking for the grain, the flaw, the place where it wanted to split. They had tried everything a reasonable person tries. Salt, smoke, the root cellar he had dug last summer, and which stayed cool for about 3 weeks in spring before the groundwater seeped up and made it a mud pit. Crocks sealed with wax, wet burlap over the butter. None of it was enough. Florida was not built for keeping things the way northern places kept things. The heat was not seasonal here. It was structural, woven into the air itself. He got up before dawn and went to sit on the porch steps, and the spring was there in the pre-light, glassy and still, smelling of moss and minerals and something clean underneath everything. June appeared in the doorway behind him with 2 cups of coffee, which was something she did when she was already thinking hard about something and needed company for the thinking. Toby said the water was cold, Elias said. It's spring-fed, June said. It's always cold down at the bottom. You know that. I know it. What are you working out? She asked. She sat on the step beside him and wrapped both hands around her cup. He was quiet for a while. The sky was turning gray-pink in the east, and an owl somewhere in the cypress made one last comment before going to sleep. What if we didn't fight the heat? He said. What if we just went around it? June tilted her head in that particular way she had. The spring is cold 6 feet down, he continued. Colder than any root cellar I've ever been in. And it's constant. It doesn't warm up in July the way the ground does. You want to put the food in the spring, she said. It was not quite a question. I want to build something that goes in the spring, he said. A room sealed up with shelves. June drank her coffee and looked at the water. Tell me more, she said. By the end of the week, there were drawings on brown paper spread across the kitchen table, weighted at the corners by a jar of dried beans, a coffee tin, and Toby's left boot, which he had placed there helpfully without being asked. The plan was unusual enough that Elias hesitated before describing it to June's brother Walt, who came by on Saturday with a haunch of venison and a skeptical face he wore as naturally as his hat. An underwater pantry, Walt said, in the tone a person uses when they want to be polite but cannot quite manage it. That's the idea, Elias said. Walt looked at the spring. He said. Walt was not the only neighbor who came by that spring. The Alderman family, Harlan and his wife Bess, farmed 40 acres to the north and had been at Willow Sink long enough to have opinions about everything. The Bess Alderman was a woman of formidable practicality who had survived things that would have finished lesser people, and she had taken a quiet liking to June from the beginning. When Bess heard about the underwater pantry, she arrived 2 days later with a basket of cornbread and her measuring tape and did not say a single discouraging word. The building of it took most of April. Elias had been a carpenter before he was a farmer, or rather, he was still a carpenter who had also become a farmer, and he approached the construction of the underwater pantry with the focused pleasure of a man working on a genuinely new problem. The basic design they had settled on was a chamber roughly 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 5 feet tall, large enough to hold the family's meat, dairy, and the more perishable vegetables, with interior shelves on 3 sides and a hinged door fitted with iron hardware salvaged from a broken wagon gate. The wood was the first challenge. It had to be dense enough not to float, watertight enough not to allow seepage, and durable enough not to rot in sustained submersion. Elias spent 2 days with a draw knife and a spoke shave working cypress planks until they were smooth and even, then fit them together in a tongue-and-groove configuration that left no gaps wider than a hair. Cypress was the right wood for the job. He had read that somewhere once, and the reading had lodged itself in his memory as useful, the way useful things did. It was naturally resistant to water and insects, heavy enough to behave well when submerged, and it grew in abundance not 50 yards from where they were working. June managed the pitch. She heated pine resin in an iron pot over the outdoor fire, stirring it until it ran smooth and dark, then brushed it into every seam and joint while the wood was still warm. She wore a rag wrapped around her right hand and worked methodically from top to bottom, going back over each seam twice. The smell of hot pine resin filled the clearing, and Toby, who had been following the construction with the intensity of a small foreman, announced that it smelled like Christmas and turpentine in the inside of a boat, all at once. The door was the most complex element. It needed to open and close reliably underwater, seal well enough to keep the contents dry, and be manageable by one person hauling on a rope from the surface. Elias hung it on cast iron hinges that he pinned with square nails driven into lead anchors, then fitted a latch mechanism made from bent iron rod that could be released by a cord running up to a wooden handle they would keep at the surface. June tested the latch 50 times, opening and closing it on dry land until it operated smoothly without sticking. "It has to work when your hands are wet and cold," she said, and kept adjusting it until it did. Toby was assigned official roles in the project, which he took seriously. He carried small tools from the porch to the worksite. He fetched water. He held boards when Elias needed a second pair of hands and was surprisingly good at this. He understood, without being told, that what was required of him was stillness and attention, and he provided both. In the evenings, he sat on the porch and drew pictures of the pantry in the dirt with a stick, explaining its features to the turtle he had found at the spring's edge. On the 15th of April, they had a box. It sat in the yard, near the water, looking exactly like what it was. A heavy wooden cabinet, sealed with pitch, fitted with iron hardware and a rope handle on the roof, and Walt, who had come by to return a borrowed maul, stood and looked at it for a long moment with his arms folded. "It's a crate," he said. "It's a cold room," Elias said. "You haven't put it in the water yet. That's tomorrow." Walt looked at the spring. He looked at the box. He rubbed the back of his neck in the way a person rubs their neck when they are trying to decide how much of their skepticism to express out loud. "I'll come by," he said, "to watch." Lowering it was an event. Elias had rigged a simple pulley system from a forked cedar post set at the spring's edge, running a half-inch hemp rope through a cast iron block he had borrowed from Harlan Alderman, who had used it to move equipment and was willing to lend it without asking too many questions. The rope ran through the block and back to a second anchor stake so that two people pulling from the bank could lower the chest steadily rather than dropping it. Walt came. The Aldermans came. Bess brought the cornbread again, which suggested she expected to be there a while. The morning was clear and already warm by 8 o'clock, the spring surface shimmering with the particular light of Florida in late April, silver white and bright, with patches of shadow where the cypress reached over the water. Lily pads had begun to spread from the north end of the basin, and there were tadpoles in the shallows, and the big soft-shell turtle Toby had named Captain was watching from a submerged log with only his head above the water. They had attached 4 iron eye bolts to the corners of the chest's roof, run the rope through them in a balanced configuration, and attached a separate anchor chain to the base. One end fastened to the chest, the other to a driven iron rod at the bottom of the spring, which Elias had placed 2 days earlier by wading in with the rod and a setting maul and working by feel in 4 feet of water. The chain would hold the pantry at the correct depth regardless of buoyancy. The rope would be used to raise and lower it for access. "All right," Elias said. He and June took the rope, while Walt stood by to manage the anchor chain. Toby was stationed at the edge in a position of great personal importance, his job being to report what he could see as the box went under. They walked it off the bank together, and for one moment the chest floated, not unexpectedly, since the interior was full of trapped air, sitting on the surface like a strange raft, and everyone watched it. "Now," Elias said. They pulled the rope into tension and began walking it down, hand over hand, the pulley taking the strain. The chest tilted, the air inside shifted, and then the first seam went under, and then the second, and the water rose around the wood in a line, and they watched, all of them, for leaks. "Bubbles," said Toby. "Lots of small ones, from the bottom corner." They stopped. Elias looked at June. "Which corner?" June said. "Yeah, the one with the mark," Toby said. He had drawn a small fish on one corner of the chest in charcoal during construction for reasons he had not fully explained. They pulled it back up. June got down on her knees and ran her fingers along the bottom corner seam and found it, a gap the width of a thumbnail where the pitch had not seated cleanly against the cypress grain. She heated the remaining pitch at the fire, worked it into the gap with a flat stick, let it cure for 1 hour, and tested the seam with a wet cloth. They lowered it again. This time Toby watched for a full 3 minutes before he said, "No bubbles." They let it down to 8 feet, where the anchor chain went taut and held it. The rope they secured to the cedar post at the bank's edge. In the water, visible through the clear spring in the slanted morning light, and the chest sat on the bottom, like something that had always been there, like it belonged. Harlan Alderman let out a breath. Bess put her hands on her hips and tilted her head in a way that was startlingly similar to June's own habit of listening for an answer. "Well," Bess said, "let's see if it works." They loaded it the next morning. A half-pound of butter, a crock of milk, a wrapped piece of pork shoulder, a bundle of turnip greens. 4 days later, June hauled it up. The butter was firm. The milk was sweet. The pork smelled of nothing but smoke and salt, exactly as it had when she lowered it. The turnip greens had wilted slightly at the edges, but were otherwise clean and cool and green, the way greens never were in a Florida summer. She brought everything to the kitchen table and stood looking at it. Then she walked back to the spring and looked down through the clear water at the dark shape of the chest sitting on the sandy bottom, surrounded by the blue-green glow of that deep, cold world. "Elias," she called, "come here." May arrived and the heat became serious. The temperature climbed into the upper 80s and stayed there, pressing down on the flatwood like a hand. The insects thickened in the evening air to the point where going outside after sundown required either a smudge fire or a particular philosophical acceptance of discomfort. The Aldermans lost a side of beef in the second week of May. It simply went bad overnight, faster than Bess had expected, and she rode over to tell June about it with a look on her face that said she was doing arithmetic. "Your milk is still sweet?" Bess asked, standing at the spring's edge and looking down through the water at the chest below. "Sweet and cold," June said. "We took some up yesterday and Toby drank 2 cups straight." Bess was quiet for a moment. A great blue heron stood at the far edge of the spring in the shallow water, absolutely still, watching something invisible below the surface with professional patience. "Harlan said it won't hold through summer," Bess said, not unkindly. "He said the water will warm up." "The spring doesn't warm that way," June said. "It comes up cold from underground. Even in August, the bottom of that basin is cold enough to raise goosebumps." Bess nodded slowly. She had the look of a person updating a calculation. The doubt was not only the Aldermans. Walt had told 2 other families about the underwater pantry, the Varnells and the Colemans, and both had sent their opinions back through the gossip chain of a small settlement, which was efficient as any telegraph. The Varnells thought it was peculiar but harmless. Old Mr. Coleman had said, with the confidence of a man who had been wrong about things before but could not currently recall any specific instance, that the wood would rot out by June and the whole contraption would fall apart on the bottom. Elias had heard this and said only, "Cypress doesn't rot." But privately he checked the rope fittings every morning, walking to the spring before the rest of the family was up, kneeling at the bank and feeling the tension in the line with his hand. The chest sat solidly at the bottom, the anchor held, the rope was sound. The real problem came from a different direction. The rope itself, the one they used to haul the chest up for loading and unloading, had been subject to a flaw in its original braiding that none of them had noticed. A section near the middle, where 3 strands had been twisted instead of 4. Under the repeated stress of raising and lowering a chest full of food, this section had been slowly thinning, strand by strand, over the course of 6 weeks. Elias found the problem on a Thursday morning in mid-May, when he went to haul the chest up for restocking. He had the line up 6 inches when he felt something wrong in the rope's behavior, a softness, an irregularity, and stopped, held it steady, and ran his free hand down the rope until he found the place where the strands had unwound to half their original diameter. If he had not stopped, it would have parted. The chest would have sunk. The anchor chain was not designed to bear the load of raising it, and they would have had to wade 8 feet of cold water with a setting bar to retrieve it. He lowered it back to the bottom, secured the rope, walked to the cabin, and sat down at the table. "I need 1/2 inch of manila hemp," he told June, "a full coil." June rode to the trading post at Willow Sink the next morning, which was a 10-mile round trip on a horse named Barley, who was reliable without being enthusiastic about the distinction. The trading post was run by a man named Cecil Pratt, who stocked rope, among many other things, and who knew the Reed family well enough to have an opinion about their underwater pantry, which he expressed while measuring out the hemp. "Your neighbor Walt mentioned it," Cecil said, feeding rope off a large spool with the unhurried competence of a man who spent his days measuring things. "Said you sunk a cedar box in your spring." "That's right," June said. "For the cold. For the cold." Cecil measured another foot of rope and made the cut. "My daddy tried keeping crocs in a well once," he said. "Water got in eventually." "The seams are pitched," June said. Cecil folded the rope into a coil and wrapped it in brown paper. "Could work," he said, with the particular intonation of someone who means the opposite. June paid for the rope and rode home. But when she told Elias what Cecil had said, she was not discouraged. She was, if anything, slightly energized in the way that a person gets energized when they know something works and others do not believe them yet. The difference between those two positions, knowing and proving, was simply a matter of time. Elias replaced the rope that afternoon, splicing the new manila hemp to the iron eye bolts with careful sailor's hitches that he had learned from a pamphlet about rigging and practiced until they were second nature. He used a doubled line now, running 2 ropes through the pulley block so that if one showed wear, the second would hold. He replaced the cedar post at the bank's edge with a heavier one, driven 2 feet deeper into the bank clay. The setback had, in its way, made the system stronger. This was something Elias noticed about problems in general, that fixing them properly left you better off than you had been before the problem appeared, because before the problem appeared, you did not know the weakness was there. Toby helped with the new post, steadying it while Elias drove it with the maul, and then stood back and regarded it with satisfaction. "Is it stronger now?" Toby asked. "Much stronger," Elias said. "Good," Toby said. Captain would have been upset if the butter box fell down and scared him. The box went back in that evening, freshly loaded. butter, a crock of buttermilk, a length of smoked fish, 2 bundles of green beans, a wedge of hard cheese June had been working on from their small milk supply. They lowered it together as the sun went down behind the cypress, the frogs beginning their evening commentary in the reeds, the water turning from silver to green to dark as the light changed. The chest settled on the bottom. The double rope held taut and clean. That night, June made a record in her household journal, a brown-paged book she kept with a stub of pencil, of everything currently stored in the pantry, with the date it had been lowered and the date they expected to retrieve it. She had started keeping these records 3 weeks earlier, and the pages showed something she had not initially planned for. They were wasting less food than at any previous point since moving to Florida. The numbers were not dramatic. They were simply, plainly, undeniably better. She showed the page to Elias. He read it twice, then set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, doing arithmetic in his head. The storm came on a Friday. Not a hurricane, a plain Florida afternoon storm, the kind that builds from nothing in 2 hours and arrives with complete conviction. Lightning struck an oak 60 yards from the spring, and the thunder that followed was a physical thing, felt in the chest. Rain came horizontal. The wind stripped leaves from the cypress and drove them into the water in brown, swirling masses. When it passed, the anchor post at the bank was still standing. But the rope, both ropes, had wrapped around a submerged cypress knee in the surge, and the chest had been twisted 45 degrees off true. The latch mechanism jammed against the bottom clay. The storm smell was still in the air the next morning, green and mineral and electric. Elias went to the spring at first light and stood at the bank, looking down. He could see the chest. It was still there, still intact, still held by the anchor chain, but the angle was wrong, and he could see from the surface that the rope configuration was compromised. He would have to go in. He sat on the bank for a while and let himself feel the full weight of it. The rope problem, the jammed latch, the question of whether the seams had held through the storm surge, the distant but real possibility that Cecil Pratt had been right, that water had gotten in, that the food was lost, that the whole contraption was, as Walt had carefully not said but plainly thought, a clever idea that didn't quite work in practice. The frogs were quiet after the storm. The spring was slightly clouded from the surge. A single lily pad turned slow circles near the surface. He thought about June measuring out the pitch with a flat stick, brushing every seam twice. He thought about Toby watching for bubbles with the seriousness of a small scientist. He thought about the record June kept in her brown journal. Less wasted, less wasted, less wasted. He pulled off his boots and went in. The water was cold. It hit him mid-chest as he waded in, and it was colder than the air and colder than the rain had been, and for a moment it was just pure sensation, cold and clear and real. He got his feet under him, found the rope tangles, and began working them free by hand underwater, feeling the hitches with his fingers. June stood on the bank and held the guide rope steady. Toby sat cross-legged 6 feet back from the edge, as instructed, watching in concentrated silence. "Almost," Elias said. The latch came free at 7:15 in the morning, and Elias hauled himself out of the water and stood on the bank dripping while June pulled the haul line, bringing the chest up hand over hand with the slow, steady rhythm of someone who had done it 24 times. The pulley turned. The rope was clean. The chest broke the surface. She undid the latch, still wet from his hands, and opened the door. The butter was firm. Every jar, every crock, every wrapped piece of meat was exactly as it had been. The smoked fish was dry. The cheese was whole. The green beans in their damp cloth were cool and crisp and entirely themselves. Not one thing had been lost. June looked at Elias, and he was standing in wet clothes in the warm morning air, and he was smiling in the way he smiled when something had gone exactly right. A quiet smile, not performed for anyone. The kind that appeared on a face before the person knew it was there. "The seams held," he said. "Of course they did," she said. They repacked the chest that morning with fresh provisions. A full pound of butter wrapped in wax paper, 2 crocks of milk, the remainder of a pork loin June had salted the previous week, a bundle of young carrots from the garden, and a small jar of strawberry preserves that June placed on the top shelf herself, setting it carefully upright. "That one's for celebrating," she said to Toby, who had waded to the bank's edge and was watching the loading process with great attention. "Celebrating what?" he asked. "I'll tell you when we open it," she said. They lowered the chest back to its place on the spring floor, straightened its angle, reset the rope lines in the proper configuration, and this time Elias drove a second anchor post on the opposite bank and ran a guide wire between them to keep the pulley centered over the chest, regardless of wind. When he was done, the setup was more precise and more durable than anything he had drawn on the brown paper plans back in April. Harlan Alderman rode by that afternoon. Not by coincidence, Elias suspected, but because word of the storm had traveled through the settlement, and Harlan was the kind of man who came by when things went wrong, which is one of the better kinds of man to have as a neighbor. He stood at the spring's edge and looked at the 2 anchor posts and the centered pulley and the clean double rope running straight down to the chest, visible below. "Storm didn't shake it loose," Elias said. "I can see that," Harlan said. He was quiet for a moment. "Bess has been asking me to look into how a person would build one of these." Elias looked at him. "For ourselves," Harlan added. "She says our spring is deep enough." "It's not complicated," Elias said. "I'll walk you through the plans." In the weeks that followed, the underwater pantry became something between a wonder and a fact of life, the way good solutions do, once they work long enough to stop being surprising. June reorganized her household around it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has finally been given the right tool. She made butter twice a week instead of once, because the butter kept. She could purchase meat in quantity when the price was right, instead of buying small amounts she would use before they turned. The garden began to actually feed them in a sustained way, because the vegetables they could not eat immediately went into the spring instead of spoiling on a shelf. She showed the journal to Bess one afternoon in early June, sitting on the porch with 2 cups of something cool. The pages showed the running record, dates in, dates out, conditions on retrieval, and the numbers were clear. "Less waste every week," Bess said. "It compounds," June said. "Once you're not replacing what you lost, you start getting ahead." Bess looked at the journal for a long moment with her measuring expression. "When Harlan builds ours," she said, "I'm going to keep a record too." Toby had, by June, developed a game he played on still afternoons when the spring surface was calm enough to see through clearly. He would lie on his stomach at the bank's edge and look down through the water at the chest below. The dark shape of it, the rope running straight up, the occasional glint of a jar through the gap around the door frame. And he would tell June what he could see. 2 crocks, he would say, the butter block, and the jar. "Can you see what's in the jar?" June asked once. "It's red," he said, "the celebrating jar." She opened it on a Sunday evening in the 3rd week of June, when the day had cooled and the frogs were starting and the cypress were casting long shadows over the spring. She hauled the chest up, unlatched the door, reached in past the cold air that poured out like water of its own kind, and found the small jar of strawberry preserves on the top shelf, exactly where she had placed it, cool and sealed and whole. She brought it inside and opened it at the table with Elias on one side and Toby on the other, and spread it on cornbread she had made that afternoon, and they ate it together in the lantern light. "What are we celebrating?" Toby asked, which he had asked several times before and been told to wait. June looked at Elias. He looked back at her. "That we stayed," she said, "and that it worked." Toby considered this for a moment, cornbread in hand, jam at the corner of his mouth. "I knew it would work," he said. There weren't any bubbles. On the longest day of the year, Elias sat on the porch steps in the evening light and watched the spring. The surface was mirror still, lily pads arranged across it like a floor someone had laid with care. Below the water, 45 degrees and constant, the cedar chest sat on the sandy bottom in the blue-green dark, holding butter and milk and meat and a crock of young carrots, keeping everything cool and whole and good. The frogs began at dusk, as always. Toby was already asleep in the loft. June came and sat beside Elias on the steps, and they did not need to say anything because they were home.